Back when I was still a senior in high school, me and my mom went on a trip to the movies. It was this regular mother-daughter bonding ritual we used to have. Catch a movie, critique it, and then hit up the Bob Evans next door for dinner. We'd always pick up my dad something in a takeout box too, and I really miss those days. But anyway, we have our food and drive home, just like we always did, and the rest of the night was uneventful. But the next morning, I wake up to a Facebook friend request from a name I didn't recognize. Thinking it might have been a mutual, I just accepted, but then like 5 minutes later, I get a message from the same account that says something like, "Hey, I know this might sound a little weird, but I saw you at the Bob Evans last night and I wondered if you might like to go out sometime." So I'm like, how did someone figure out my name? Did they overhear my mom say it or something? Like, I get he was polite, but it still creeped me out. Why would you go to those lengths to find me? And he must have been looking for hours. Immediately, there's all these red flags, so I had no intention of accepting his invitation, but at the same time, I didn't want to be a jerk to him. So I messaged him back like, "Hi, yeah, I was there, but I'm actually kind of seeing someone right now, and I don't think they'd be too happy if we went out." At first, their reply was encouraging, and they seemed to take it on the chin. They say like, that sucks. Sorry if this is awkward now." I respond, "No, don't worry. You didn't know. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, though." It was a close-ended reply, the kind that's designed to just end the conversation. Next thing, he starts typing, and I figured he's going to just carry on being gentlemanly, creepily direct, but gentlemanly, I suppose. But no. There's this very subtle shift in his tone when he says, "I just figured, since I went to all this effort to find you, you might give me a chance." This is where I saw a kind of, opportunity. I had literally zero clue how this guy had found me, and I didn't like the idea that just anyone could look me up online no matter how innocent their intentions were. So I straight up asked him, "How did you find me?" He starts typing, then stopping, typing, then stopping, and I can tell he's thinking of the right way to phrase it. Then he says something like, "Where there's a will, there's a way. I can find anyone online. It's easy. When I set my mind to something, I achieve it. Is your current boyfriend an overachiever like that?" I distinctly remember him using that term, overachiever, and was honestly so cringe. If I wasn't put off before, I certainly was then. But still, I wanted to find out how this creep had managed to track me down. So I might have done something stupid to get him to talk and said, "Honestly, no, and it's kind of hot that you're so smart and stuff. So how did you do it?" He responds, "I was the one who swiped your mom's card," he replied. So, a liar too. He wasn't some hacker. He just worked at the Bob Evans. So yeah, he probably had overheard my name, then just matched it up with the name on my mom's card. Then bingo, he finds me on Facebook. I had to hold back from just letting loose on this guy. But if he was that much of a psycho, then I figured it was better to not make him mad. "Ah, sneaky. I like it," I replied. "But like I said, kinda seeing someone right now, so thanks, but no thanks. Bye." I mute the conversation, but don't block the guy or unfriend him or anything. See, making him mad I was worried about. Then I just go about the rest of my day. Yeah, I told all my friends how creepy I was, and I casually suggested to my mom we pick a new food venue for our post-movie dinners, but other than that, I just went about my day as usual. It's kind of weird how this pattern repeated itself. The first time I'm asleep, blissfully ignorant that some creep is plugging my name into Facebook, probably to perv at my display picture. The second time I had him on mute, so I had no idea what was going on in that little message thread. It wasn't until later on that night that I opened my messenger on my phone and actually saw the little 44 notification count next to his name that I realized he'd sent me other messages. And yes, it did say 44. He'd sent 44 different messages, mostly rants, and he'd been sending them on and off all day. But it wasn't until I actually read what they said that I started to freak out. I'm not going to type up everything I remember him saying, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you will be able to guess the majority of it. Think nice guy style put-downs coupled with threats of actual violence. He basically said that if he'd managed to track me down online in a few hours, imagine what he could learn by the end of the week. He said he had friends that would help him break into our house. After that, they'd tie my parents up, kill them in front of me, then take turns abusing me until I was used up and lifeless. And that's the clean version of it, condensed into 2 sentences. 44 different lengthy messages he sent me. Think about that. The final message I read, it went on, before I ran downstairs to tell my mom and dad, was the message that read, "I'm in my car, and I'm looking for your house." I didn't know he was just trying to scare me, so I was crying as Dad called the cops. The guy ended up getting arrested for the threats he made, and I know he got fired from the Bob Evans because my mom kicked up a stink about it after the arrest. I never saw the guy again, so I'm thinking it was a case of his bark being louder than his bite. But I know that there are other women out there who aren't so lucky, and their stalkers are much more willing to get up close and personal. I just hope we can one day live in a world where men don't act all predatory and creepy with women they like. Like, it's so counterintuitive to what we want in a man. I wish they just understand that. But till then, I suppose all we can do is be safer online and with dating apps, and hope we never run into that one sick psychopath that won't take no for an answer. My stalker ended up being the one person in my life that I thought would never do me any harm. My husband of 7 years. And let me tell you, he made my life absolute torture. I'm going to show you my age a little here by saying that at the time this all occurred, what we might call stalker laws these days just didn't exist in the same way. There wasn't the same sort of access to restraining orders. Women's shelters weren't nearly as common or well-funded as they are now. It wasn't a great time to be a divorcee, and if it wasn't for the fact that I was a state employee, I think I would have just been left to deal with it on my own. In the state this took place, it's a serious offense to harass an employee of the state government, so I basically ended up with state troopers as bodyguards for a while. They were wonderful, and I honestly owe them a lot. They would walk me to and from my car. They would come into the office to check on me at least once a day. The only thing was, they couldn't follow me home. The place I'd be alone with 2 young children who didn't understand why their daddy was so angry. This all started when my ex filed for a divorce. We'd already been separated for a while by the time the papers came, and honestly, I totally checked out of the marriage. It was dysfunctional and abusive, and apart from my children, who I love more than anything in the world, I had wasted 7 years of my life with a violent narcissist who I believe took pleasure in my misery. It was typically pig-headed of him to assume I'd contest the divorce, that I'd be unable to fend for myself, and that somehow I'd want him back. But I didn't. I just signed those papers on the dotted line and mailed them back to the courthouse. If he'd bothered to pay any attention to my life before he'd separated, he'd have known I'd gotten 2 serious promotions in 6 months. One earned and one an opportunity, and I was making only a few grand less than him per year. I didn't want child support or alimony. I just wanted him out of my life. When he found out I wasn't contesting the divorce, that was when everything went to chaos. His pathetic little attempt to intimidate me hadn't worked, and because he couldn't control me anymore, he turned rabid. He would call me at least 30, sometimes 40 times a day, to hiss threats of violence down the line at me. He even called me at work. Then, when I had his number screened, he started calling my boss and lying about my behavior in an attempt to get me fired. He called my coworkers and harassed them. On more than one occasion, he came to my office and was caught letting the air out of my tires or keying my car door. He called my family to threaten them as well, then tried to turn my children against me by playing the victim whenever he had custody. Things just got worse and worse and worse. He had my check garnished by telling the county's office that he was the custodial parent, which was a complete lie. Then, without even bothering to check with me or their school records, they just started deducting half my paycheck for child support. I had to take an entire day off of work that I definitely couldn't afford and drive many miles to straighten out this freaking mess that he'd caused. He also called my pastor to cry on his shoulder after making up a bunch of absolute nonsense about me. He was looking for allies. He was looking to alienate me from all those I cared about, and for a while, it actually kind of worked. It was utterly humiliating, and for a while I couldn't get any more than 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night, and that's if sleep came at all. The final straw came when he broke into my house one night and tortured me for 6 hours, all the while his own 2 children were screaming and crying in the next room. My whole face was so swollen that I was barely recognizable, and after he beat me half to death, he turned out to be so drunk that he actually fell asleep on what had been our marriage bed for 7 long years. Once he passed out, I silently slipped out of bed, then crept downstairs to call the police. He woke up to the sight of a cop spraying mace in his eyes, and God did it feel good to hear him scream. Once they hauled him off to jail on assault charges, the cops took pictures of my face to use as evidence against him in court, and for the first time in a long time, I actually felt safe. He went to jail that night, but nothing stopped him from bailing out just a few days later. Luckily, the cops were nice enough to call me to let me know that he was out, but I was still anxious because he'd left his car at my house, which obviously meant he had to come back to get it. I stayed up all night waiting for him to come and get his car. I didn't want to sleep because I didn't know what he would do next. There was every chance that he'd come at night just to mess with me. He finally came walking up at 1:30 a.m., but instead of starting some kind of confrontation, I honestly never saw him move so fast. He wanted to get out of there quickly, and it was clear he hadn't forgotten how terrible it was to get arrested. Finally, it seemed like his manic, violent behavior was starting to subside. The calls and threats kept coming for months, even though I had a restraining order. And on the advice of my lawyer, I began taping them. This is probably the number one thing that ended up making a difference, so ladies, please, get into the habit of taping phone calls and screenshotting anything from your stalkers. Small digital recorders are fairly cheap these days, and they're just as important as mace or tasers in these situations. Even if mine was a long time ago, I'm glad I had something to record it with. Next, he started driving by my house, and it got so bad that I went to stay with my mom because I was just so frightened and exhausted. I was just about to close her front door when I saw his van drive by, and that accounts for one of the few times where I actually became hysterical. Like I said, I was just worn out, emotionally and physically. I called 911 and told them that my stalker was threatening myself and my elderly mother, but only minutes before they showed up, he left, almost like he had a police scanner in his car or something. I went to stay with a friend that night, and you can bet your butt I took my mom with me. I didn't want him to see my car there and break into the house and hurt my mom. She's a frail widow, and the fact that he might have targeted her too was what hit me so hard. It really felt like no one was safe. One night I went to an outdoor music show with an old friend of mine. She told me that I needed the stress release, and she was dead right about that. And on top of that, it was a family concert, so I could have the kids with me. The way I saw it, if the kids were with me, they were safe as possible. Then just as I was getting relaxed, I looked up and saw his van coming around the corner, and at the same time, I realized I couldn't see my kids. I can barely describe the kind of terror that gripped me in that moment. I spun around on the spot and saw that there were a bunch of kids playing in the grass nearby. I spotted my young son, but my 8-year-old daughter was nowhere to be seen. Naturally, I started calling her name as loud as I could, walking towards where the van was parked to make sure it wasn't my husband. That's when I saw him, drunk again. My daughter came running when she heard his voice, and she was just about to climb into the passenger seat when I caught her. She had no idea how trashed he was, and I think it says a lot that she was used to seeing him like that, how seeing him all red-eyed and slurring his words was like a normal thing for her by that point. I ran to the nearest phone booth, this was way before cell phones, to tell the cops that my ex-husband had just tried to kidnap his own children. I didn't realize how badly I was screaming into the phone because when I looked around, almost everybody at the concert was staring at me. The cops put an APB out on his van, but my nerves were fried, and that night was yet another that came and went without sleep. The next morning, my heroes, the state police, called me to tell me his van was now at his house. I jumped in my car and drove the 60 miles in half the normal time. When I got there, they had his house surrounded. A guy with a bullhorn was saying how they knew he was there because he answered the phone. I had no idea what was going on, but when I asked them and they identified, all they were interested in asking me is if he had a gun. I told them I wasn't sure. He never had one when we lived together, but then again, a lot of things had changed since we were living together. We sat there for like an hour, and no matter how many times the cops called his phone, he just wouldn't pick it up. Finally, the front door opens and a whole bunch of cops are screaming at him to put his hands up as he walked out. The whole time he was just hungover and feeling uncooperative, where, as we were all thinking we might just come out shooting. He gets taken right back to jail, then I drive home again, just emotionally frazzled. He ended up taking a plea bargain and just got probation, but I think the second encounter with the cops actually tipped things over the edge for him. The way he was going, he was either going to end up dead or in jail, and I think that finally got through his thick skull because after that, the harassment started to peter out until at last, I had peace again. Moving me and my kids out of state sure helped, but to my knowledge, he's made no attempt to follow us at all. I'm sorry this comment ended up being so long. I just saw the post and I knew that I had one heck of a story to contribute. Hopefully women and girls can read this and learn a thing or two from my experience and my mistakes so the same thing doesn't happen to them. Because honestly, I wouldn't wish that kind of thing on my worst enemy. It's been almost 10 years since I suffered the horrors of being stalked, and I still have nightmares about it. I remember it being so bad that I was scared to take a lunch at work because he'd just be waiting in my car for me. I was too scared to even go home sometimes because, on more than one occasion, he'd broken in and waited for me. The cops charged him for breaking and entering, but since it was his first criminal offense, he got away with nothing but a slap on the wrist. After that, he just got creative and found other ways to psychologically torture me. I'd go to work and have gifts from him left at my door. I'd see him parked across the street from my house. He'd call any chance he could, switching up every week or so whenever I blocked a number. SIM cards and burners were just so cheap that he could easily afford to do it. One night I was sleeping and he somehow got into the house, I think through the garage. I'll never forget the feeling of waking up to him dragging me across my bed. That messed me up the most. I was terrified. I didn't move or say a thing for what happened next. In fact, I'd rather not touch on that at all. Needless to say, after what he did, I went straight to the cops. He backed off for a while but left a flash drive on my doorstep one day. It turned out he'd filmed what he did to me, but it obscured his face. That's what he used to get the conviction, because he could hide his face, but he couldn't hide certain distinct features on his body. Then match that up with it being my apartment and bingo. He was in prison now for a long time. This was a guy I briefly dated too. I never imagined in a million years on that first date that he'd end up being as evil as he was. But I hear people say that about some serial killers too. How they're real nice and charming until you actually get to know them. The whole ordeal had a really negative effect on my dating life. I still have trouble meeting up with new people, and if a guy acts clingy at all, I just ghost. I've done it to some pretty nice guys too. Actual nice guys. I feel like they're trying to track or control me, and I just get all of those feelings of, like, being trapped, and then I just can't do it anymore. Okay, so I have something of a confession. I get totally out of control when I have a crush, and I suppose if you were to phrase it so insensitively, then I guess you could call me a stalker. It probably took way longer than it should for me to realize it too. Like I just figured I was, I don't know, intense, passionate, whatever you want to call it. When actually, what I feel for guys is, well, as my psychiatrist put it, It's unhealthy. Whenever I have a crush on a guy, it builds and builds until it's almost completely out of control. Sure, I get the usual stuff at first. Butterflies in my tummy, that giddy euphoria people feel when their crush is around. But I get other things too. Like, there's a lot more, and some things that people might consider kinda scary too. When I like a guy, they're constantly on my mind. They're usually the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning, and usually the last thing I think about before I sleep too. I look up every social media account they have, and guys tend to be much less careful about their privacy settings, which makes that whole thing super easy. I make sure to see every single post, every comment, every friend, every photo they're in. I check their social media accounts usually more than 4 or 5 times a day. I also Google them online, hoping to stumble across anything new. For years I told myself that I just like knowing things about my crushes. Like, isn't that the point of loving someone? To know them as well as you know yourself? Well, again, according to my psychiatrist, not in quite the same way as I imagine. I track down where they live and spend way too long on Google Street View just admiring the place. I never go by or do anything though. I never want the crush to know how obsessed I really am. That would be absolutely mortifying. My psychiatrist says this is how I know what I'm doing is wrong and why he knew we could make progress if I put my mind to it. I also tend to get real jealous. I try not to show it, but I have to admit that seeing them having fun with anyone that isn't me, it really tears me up inside. I grow to hate their friends and family immensely, self-inserting myself into every little moment of their lives and telling myself, it better be with me, more fun, more special, more magical and memorable. How intensely I like someone tends to be based on how long I spend around them and in what context. Like, the less I see them, the less I like them. The more I see them, it's like I'm exposed to something they're pumping out, like seeds taking root in my brain almost. A good example would be this. In 5th grade, I liked this guy. In 6th grade, the same guy, I became obsessed with him. Summer rolled around and I stopped. School started, I started liking him again. Repeat for 8th grade. Then he moved away for good and I stopped liking him for good. It was like I couldn't live without him for the longest time, but then, out of sight, out of mind too. I know that's not how other people function. Normal people miss someone no matter how far away they are, and no matter how long it's been since they saw them. Not me though, and I think that might be the only saving grace for some of these guys. I can't control my emotions even with the medication I'm given. It's one of the biggest challenges I face with my condition. If I didn't care so much about what I thought my crush thought of me, I would show up to his house and look in through the window, hoping to see him. I would pester all his friends to get every bit of info about him. I thank God sometimes that I've not gone too far, that I still have one foot grounded in reality even if the other is hovering over the abyss. Judging from what I've said so far, I'm guessing that most of you would assume me to be a violent person, like how a lot of those psychopaths and Let's Not Meet stories end up being. But in fact, I'm the opposite of that. No one I know would ever think of me with such thoughts. I'm bubbly and kind towards those who are kind towards me. I never resort to physical confrontation. It's just not my personality. No one even has a clue how obsessive my thoughts get, and aside from this little confession, I tend to keep things that way. I hate how I get so attached to people, but as my psychiatrist says, at least you're self-aware. I've liked someone for 6 months currently, and I despise myself for it. I pretend not to be obsessed all the time and refrain from speaking about the person 24/7, even though I want to, because I don't want friends and, most importantly, my crush knowing about my condition. Like, I'm terrified I will ruin my life because people would judge me for it without getting to know me. I guess that's part of why I'm writing this too. Bottom line is, I need help on how to cope with these feelings if I can. I surprisingly let go very easily. You know that kid who moved in 8th grade, that I was obsessed with for like 3 years? When I found out he was moving, I was shocked and sad for about 15 minutes and then didn't really care. It was like whatever bug inside my brain just said, oh well, on to the next one I guess. So, my issue is just how to handle my feelings when I like someone. Keep in mind, This is just a light description of my issue. I felt a lot more than what I described here so far. I hope I get over my current crush over the summer and don't have any classes with him next year, since I would probably fall for him again. I rarely get crushes, but when I do, they better watch out. I've only had 4 crushes in total in my life so far, and 3 were part of my obsessions. Anyway, that's about it. I hope I could provide some insight into how female stalker types work, because all that yandere stuff is just a bunch of bull. That's like a guy's projection, the ignorance of thinking that guys and girls think or act similar, when honestly, the reality is much more insidious, and arguably, much more terrifying. Perhaps the most famous incidents of stalking arise when, fittingly, fixated persons choose to stalk celebrities. Being in the public eye can have its good side, but also some pretty significant bad sides too, and just one of those is the fact that you're exposed to people who might develop something of an obsession. Sometimes these obsessions can be nothing more than innocently irritating, but other times, they can be downright dangerous. Beyoncé Knowles is certainly no stranger to having to deal with crazed fans, but one unhinged obsessive began to peddle some pretty sinister rumors around 2013. When due to perform in London for the Sound of Change concert in 2013, Beyoncé had to make sure that she and all her staff kept an eye out for a fan who believed that she was actually an imposter. It all started when a man named Bassie Essien approached her with a book of notes on religion, claiming what it contained would help her. But when Beyoncé proved to be less than enthusiastic about the gift, Essien began to accuse her of having killed the real Beyoncé before replacing her. The singer's management managed to obtain an anti-harassment order which barred Bassie Essien from attending any of Beyoncé's future events. But still, the encounter was definitely one which left her shaken for some time afterward. Singer Lana Del Rey had also dealt with a harrowing stalker experience when an obsessive fan posted a series of disturbing Facebook statuses in which he claimed to be planning to kidnap her after a show. 43-year-old Florida man Michael Hunt was arrested in February of 2018, while police noted that his detainment stemmed from cryptic and threatening messages. Hunt called Del Rey his queen and his wife, and wrote that after her show in Orlando, our decisions will be as one. I love you so much, Lana. I can't wait to be back in your arms in a few days, baby. He wrote in one post. It's probably my last day on Facebook. I hope to see y'all on the walkabout in your life. Be good, and I'll see you on the other side, everybody. Hunt was arrested just a few hundred feet from the venue in which Lana was set to perform, and to the horror of all involved, he was discovered to be in possession of a 3-inch folding knife. As a result, he was charged with attempted kidnapping with a weapon and aggravated stalking with a credible threat. In the end, Hunt agreed to a plea deal, pleaded no contest to a stalking charge, and was sentenced just to 1 year in prison. Del Rey, on the other hand, admitted she was in fear for her safety, and later addressed her stalker's arrest on social media, commenting that attempting to bring weapons to her show was on another level. Actress Keira Knightley found that some stalkers aren't content to focus their obsession on one person, as her entire family was targeted by a man named Mark Revel. Mark seemed just as happy to terrorize her husband and 2-year-old daughter, delivering terrifying handwritten messages to her home, as well as tweeting out sinister threats. He claimed to be madly in love with Knightley and simply wanted to show her his music, but according to a victim impact statement read in court, his actions left the actress feeling scared every time she left the house. But perhaps Mark's most famous act was to show up at Knightley's home before meowing through the letterbox. Keira's husband, musician James Wrighton, apparently had to physically chase Mark Revel away. He also sent her a USB stick that was filled with self-composed music inspired entirely by cats, and after analyzing its contents, Knightley's lawyers would describe them as extremely disturbing. Revel had a prior conviction related to turning up nude at women's homes, and apparently referred to himself as the public executioner on social media at one point, tweeting out, "James Wrighton and Keira Knightley are not going to get much help from the police. If writing is play the devil, maybe I is play public executioner, yeah? Of course, not is death threat, he wrote. The court ultimately ordered Revel, who had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, to be held in a psychiatric hospital indefinitely, and thus a clear and present danger to the public was taken off the streets. Actress Gwyneth Paltrow is said to have suffered a long-term incident of stalking, one that lasted almost 20 years. Dante Michael Sue sent the actress over 60 different letters and packages between 2019 and 2015, with some of the packages containing marriage proposals as well as explicit adult material. Sue explained his behavior by claiming insanity, but after his eventual arrest, a judge sentenced him to undergo treatment at a mental health facility. Yet he was arrested again in 2015 when he began sending Paltrow letters again. This is a case that has gone on for Miss Paltrow for 17 years. Her sense of security has been shattered by this man, said California District Attorney Wendy Segal. Paltrow herself called the ordeal a very long and very traumatic experience during her testimony, and said it had left her feeling very upset. Sue told a jury that he wrote to Paltrow after an earlier conviction in an attempt to earn her forgiveness, and to let her know that he was still interested in marrying her. But they were not fooled, and Sue was eventually in prison for his actions. Multi-platinum singer Taylor Swift has also been forced to deal with more than her fair share of obsessed fans. A man named Frank Edward Hoover took the concept of obsessive fandom to a terrifying new level when in 2015, he began sending the pop star's father, Scott Swift, some highly disturbing handwritten letters in which he promised to slaughter the entire Swift family. Referring to himself as the real Son of God, Hoover called the Swifts an evil family of devils and wrote, "This article is not a joke, and is why God is going to burn them in the desert for me." Hoover was detained by police after allegedly following Swift and her family from a concert venue to the airport where they were scheduled to board a private plane. When he got close to Taylor's car, the singer's bodyguards stopped and questioned him, at which point he repeatedly said that his reason for being there was to accompany Taylor wherever she goes. Back in 2012, teeny bopper icon Justin Bieber was almost the victim of one of the most horrifying stalking plots of all time, after an ex-con came up with a plan to abduct and mutilate Bieber, all because the young singer didn't respond to his fan mail. Dana Martin, who is currently serving life in a New Mexico prison for murder and assault, is said to have conspired with two fellow ex-cons to kidnap Bieber while he was in New York City. The trio planned to kill Bieber's body and then Bieber himself, and then Martin was supposed to castrate Bieber before killing him. Dana Martin, who had a Bieber tattoo on his leg, later told investigators that he was infatuated with Bieber and was offended when the sorry singer never returned his letters. This perceived slight made Mr. Martin upset, and that, coupled with Mr. Martin's perception of being a nobody in prison, led him to begin plotting the kidnap and murder, reads a portion of his arrest warrant. Dana reportedly planned to pay $2,500 for each of Bieber's testicles, adding that, "If I was free, here's what I'd want to do. Put Bieber in a cage, abuse him repeatedly, and put the whole thing on YouTube." Bieber's ex-girlfriend Selena Gomez also had to deal with a stalking situation that was so disturbing it may have forced her to sell a multi-million-dollar mansion. Within less than a week of moving into her gigantic new home in Calabasas, 20-year-old Che Cruz was arrested for trespassing onto Gomez's property twice in 1 week. In the first instance, Che broke into Gomez's guest house after first ringing the doorbell and asking the singer's friend if Gomez was home. He then appeared to depart the premises, but he was later found hiding in the compound's guest house. A judge ordered Cruz to keep his distance from Gomez and her property before sentencing him to 45 days in jail. Yet the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office confirmed that Cruz spent just 2 days of his 6-week sentence behind bars before he was released. And preposterously, he was rearrested just hours later after allegedly hopping a fence to once again trespass on Gomez's property. Cruz, of no fixed abode, pled guilty to stalking charges before a judge ordered him to stay away from Gomez in her house for a full 10 years. He was also ordered to complete 6 months in a treatment facility, as well as undergoing psychological treatment for an additional year. Gomez, after installing a gate around her property and reportedly phoning 911 numerous times in the months that followed Cruz's break-in, put the house up for sale the following year, as she was clearly sick of dealing with an obsessive psychopath who just wouldn't give up. It seems that no matter how bad stalking can get for the average person, the huge amount of exposure that celebrities get, as well as the pedestal society puts them on, results in much more intense and potentially dangerous incidents of stalking. Yet it seems it's just one of the many prices a person has to pay for all that fame and all that fortune. Rebecca Lucille Schaefer was born in Eugene, Oregon on November 6th of 1967. Her father, Dr. Benson Schaefer, was a child psychologist, while her mother was a writer and instructor at the Portland Community College. Given how proud she was of her Jewish roots, a young Rebecca would dream of becoming a rabbi. But after a chance encounter with a modeling agent, she began modeling clothes during her junior year in high school. Rebecca would become a popular subject of many photographers, and she made appearances in department store catalogs and television commercials, as well as an extra in a straight-to-TV movie. She was so successful that in August of 1984, her parents gave her permission to move to New York City to pursue a full-time modeling career. At 5'7", she was considered too short for high-fashion modeling jobs and struggled to find work as a result. Rebecca even moved to Japan for a short stint in the hopes of finding work there, but found Japanese modeling standards were even stricter than back in the United States. Yet within just a few months of moving back to New York, Rebecca landed her first TV role, playing Annie Barnes on ABC's One Life to Live. The following year, she appeared on the cover of 17 magazine, which caught the attention of television producers who were casting for a sitcom called My Sister Sam. Through a series of grueling auditions, Rebecca won the role of Patricia Russell, and the series was initially a hit, but it was canceled halfway through its second season in 1988 due to falling ratings. Yet the role established Rebecca's acting career and earned her several other roles in a variety of different productions. However, the role also brought her to the attention of an extremely dangerous and unstable young man, one that would have an indelible and catastrophic impact on her life, Robert John Bardo. The youngest of 7 children, Bardo was the son of a non-commissioned officer in the United States Air Force who had met his mother whilst deployed in Japan. Due to the nature of his father's occupation, the Bardo family moved frequently, eventually settling in Tucson, Arizona in 1983, and to say young Robert had a rough childhood would barely broach the issue. A young Robert was placed in foster care after abuse from one of his siblings got so bad that he threatened to take his own life. Couple that with the Bardo family's history of mental illness, and it's quite clear that he never really had a shot at an emotionally stable adulthood. By the age of 15, Bardo had been institutionalized to treat severe emotional problems, and it was around then that he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Shortly after, he dropped out of Pueblo Magnet High School and began working as a janitor at a Jack-in-the-Box restaurant. By the time he was 19, he had been arrested 3 times for disorderly conduct, and Bardo's neighbors would frequently complain that he exhibited unexplainably strange and threatening behavior towards them. Yet, it seems they had no idea how deep Bardo's madness extended. You see, Bardo had a dangerously obsessive personality, and found himself increasingly obsessed with certain female celebrities. The first target of his dangerous obsession would be 13-year-old Samantha Smith, an American schoolgirl, peace activist, and child actress from Manchester, Maine, who became famous during the Cold War. After her death on August 25th of 1985 in the Bar Harbor Airlines Flight 1808 plane crash, Bardo was devastated, but it was during a period of intense mourning that he discovered Rebecca Schaefer while watching My Sister Sam. After writing Rebecca numerous letters confessing his love for her, Bardo attempted to gain access to the set of My Sister Sam, but was turned away by security. It was then that Bardo turned to a terrifyingly creative method of discovering Rebecca's whereabouts. Bardo contacted a Los Angeles-based private detective agency promising to pay handsomely if they could obtain the address of one Rebecca Schaefer. Using the California Department of Motor Vehicles records, the private detective successfully obtained Rebecca's address, passing it along to Bardo for a tidy sum. They had absolutely no idea how unhinged Bardo was, or what the ramifications of their actions were. Yet they were soon to find out just how irresponsible they'd truly been. On July 18th of 1989, Bardo drove to Los Angeles to confront Rebecca at her home. He was angry because she hadn't bothered to reply to any of his letters, but not only that, he was furious because she'd appeared in a raunchy love scene in the movie Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills. Bardo allegedly told Rebecca that she'd lost her innocence, and that in partaking in such an impure movie scene had become just another Hollywood harlot. He ended the bizarre tirade by assuring her that he was a big fan, and all he wanted was the best for her. Rebecca was terrified, and apparently told Bardo she wanted nothing to do with him, slamming the door in his face and rushing to call the police. They assured Rebecca they'd come over to her as soon as they could, but the situation wasn't obviously an emergency in the moment, and there were no lights or sirens rushing to her apartment. In the meantime, a heartbroken Bardo walked over to a nearby diner to get some breakfast. His plan to win over Rebecca had failed, but he also had a plan B, one he would use in the event of Rebecca's rejection. About an hour later, Rebecca's apartment doorbell rang again. Assuming it was the cops, she rushed to answer the door, but when she opened it, the only person she saw standing before her was Robert Bardo. Robert then raised a Ruger 357 handgun and shot Rebecca through the heart. He then tossed a copy of Catcher in the Rye into her apartment and was later arrested in Tucson while wandering aimlessly through traffic. The following year, Robert tried to argue that he was criminally insane, but a judge dismissed the idea and labeled him a dangerously obsessive but otherwise mentally competent person. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and is currently serving his sentence in California's Avenal State Prison. As a consequence of Bardo's actions and his methods of obtaining Schaefer's address, the U.S. Congress passed the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, which prohibits state departments of motor vehicles from disclosing the home addresses of state residents. Rebecca's murder also prompted the first anti-stalking state laws, including the California Penal Code 646.9, which was essentially the nation's first law against obsessive or fixated persons. It was a nice gesture, but few deny that they came too little, too late for Rebecca, who needed protecting from a dangerous, violent stalker long before there were any legal means to combat them. We can only hope these laws are direct and robust enough to stop the same thing from happening again, but given the determination of the human spirit, that seems like very wishful thinking indeed. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in huge compilations and save massive on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers.